Hey, and welcome to another Tech Tuesday. This is Chad from Ascension Worship, and this week we are playing around with the Behringer Wing, and figured that you guys might want to get my first impressions on it. So this video is going to be just kind of me going through some things that I've found in the first 2 days of playing with this board, some things that I think are important to note, and things that maybe are hard to see when you watch some of the other videos that are online. So I'm going to try and just give a really basic overview. I'm not really doing a tutorial on this. And you'll notice I am using my phone as a camera. I do apologize. I'll try and keep it as steady as possible. Usually when I do these kinds of videos, I use the offline editor, but this board's so new that there is not an offline editor yet. So please bear with me on that, and I'll try and show you visually as best as I can with my phone what we're looking at here. So let me just start by saying that I am overall very impressed with this console. I'm going to start with a few concerns that I have, and then I'll kind of give some pros and cons as we go, and end with some things that I'd like to see that hopefully a firmware update will provide in the near future. My biggest concern, let me see if I can get it to do it, is screen ghosting or ghost touches every once in a while. This screen is awesome. It is raised up right now. It's very sturdy feeling. It's very sensitive, and that might be the problem because sometimes I'll get random selections of things that I did not do, and a menu item will pop up that's not something that I chose to click on. Overall, this is not a major problem. It is a problem, however, if you're in the patch window. You may be patching one thing and then all of a sudden something you didn't click on gets clicked on. So that is a bit of concern, so I will keep an eye on that. But overall, it's just a minor nuisance that occasionally happens, so hopefully that's the end of it. So a brief overview, because some of the things that this board does that are unusual might be confusing when you're trying to get an idea of what's happening. Let's start by talking about inputs. This board is considered a 48-channel console. So we've got 1 through 12, 13 through 24, through 36, through 40, and then we have 8 aux ins. Now, let me clarify something, because this is how this board is maybe a little bit different compared to, say, an Allen and Heath SQ. On an Allen and Heath SQ, you've got 48 channels, and you can mono or stereo some of those channels, but you have 48 channels to work with. This console is 48 either mono or stereo channels, so you could technically, if you had all stereo things, you could input 96 channels on here. However, one important distinction compared to a console like that is that on an Allen Heath, all 48 channels have full processing. However, on this console, they do differentiate between the first 40 inputs and the last 8, which they consider to be auxiliary inputs. So, for example, here's a channel strip for a full channel, and you'll notice that there's quite an involved EQ. There's gate, compressor, and we have 2 insert slots on here. Whereas if we look at an auxiliary input, like our aux input here, we don't have the gate, the compressor. We're missing one of the inserts. The EQ has less bands on it, and another. There's no input delay if you want to have input delay. So similar to the X32, the X32 had 32 full processing channels, and then 8 aux channels. It's the same thing here. We've got 40 full processing channels that any of them can be stereo, and then we have 8 aux channels. So may or may not be a big deal for you. Just make sure that when you are planning out your patch sheet that you try and put the things that you know that are going to need those things again: gate, compressor, 2 insert slots, input delay, and a full EQ on your first 40 channels, and leave your last 8 for things like your PC that hopefully you don't have to do a ton of work to. Another thing to be aware of, and this is not a big deal to me, but it's worth noting. So Behringer assumes that you're going to be using Digital Snake to get your inputs on stage, which is a really good way to go. So be aware that there are only 8 XLR inputs on the back of this console. Another thing that you need to know that I would have assumed differently is that your Talkback channel is not in addition to those 8. It has to be one of those 8. So really, if you're using a Talkback channel, you only have 7 XLR inputs on the back of the console. Again, not necessarily a big deal. You do still have 8 TRS inputs for things like your computer, your auxiliary channels, that kind of thing. But do just be aware that your Talkback channel is going to eat up one of those 8 channels, one of those 8 inputs. All right, let's talk about outputs. This console does handle output buses and channels a little bit different than the X32. I see there's one of those ghost clicks. I didn't click on that. So again, all the output buses can be mono or stereo. So we have 16 buses. We have 4 mains, which is interesting. A potential use for that could be something like maybe you have your main mix that your crowd is hearing, and as basically something that you would use as a post-fade matrix mix that maybe needs some adjustments. So maybe your broadcast mix you could use as one of your 2, 3, and 4, or maybe you're going to turn on and off things like a Spotify channel may not be going to main 2, but it is going to main 1. There's some interesting things you can do with it. And then we've got our 8 matrices, which again can be mono or stereo. And then we only have 8 DCAs, which is a little disappointing. I was hoping for at least 12 on this console, but I'm used to 8, and it's not really the end of the world for me. One interesting thing with the buses is that the buses can, of course, be sent to your main mixes. They can be sent to your matrices, but you can also send the bus returns back on themselves on the first 8 buses. So, for example, I have a drum submix that I'm using for parallel compression. If I wanted to, I could send that return channel to any of these first 8 buses. So if I have my drummer, for example, on bus 4, I could send him the compressed version of the drum kit, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. So with that in mind, when you're prepping your scenes, what you may want to do is kind of like how the X32 scene was, sorry, I'm getting bouncy here, is specify buses 1 through 8 for in-ear mixes. 9 through 12 would probably be best to be as either subgroups or monitor mixes. 13 through 16, you're probably going to want to have as your effects sends. And so that would probably be the best way to kind of make the most out of what you have here. Another interesting difference compared to the X32, on the X32, you would apply delay if you needed to your 16 outputs. On here, you can't do it on the output. Instead, you do it on the bus itself. So if I wanted to say this matrix here, so if I wanted to maybe go to this matrix, let's see, I'm trying to do this one-handed here. You've got an output delay on the matrix instead of on the physical output. Another interesting thing about the matrices on here, if you notice, they have direct inputs on the matrix. So people a lot of times will use a matrix for their broadcast mix, but then when they want to add something like, say, the room mics, they don't really have a way to do that. Well, now you can direct input the room mic left and room mic right, or different things that you might want to send here, and you can level this out going to the matrix. So generally, matrices on boards like Yamaha, you can send inputs or buses to the matrix. On the Behringer, it's usually just mixes. So this is kind of a neat middle of the road option, which could be interesting if you are running out of buses, but you need to use a matrix as a broadcast mix off your front of house console. This could be an interesting way to do that. All right, let's talk about build quality. So when I was about to see the movie Avatar, everyone told me that Avatar sucked. And so when I went to actually go watch Avatar, it wasn't great, but it was way better than what they had told me that it was going to be. So it's kind of like that with this console. Everyone told me that the faders were garbage, and they aren't great. They're definitely not as good as like an M32, but they're not nearly as bad as I was expecting. And the console itself is actually incredibly heavy-duty feeling. It's very heavy. I was shocked when I went to go lift it out of the box at how heavy it was. If you've seen pictures, you know there's not much underneath this surface layer. There's a smaller footprint to this. So I expected the board to actually be closer to the weight of the Behringer X32, but I was shocked at how heavy it was. It seems like it's built well. The screen feels really sturdy. The buttons feel great. The knobs feel sturdy. So overall, I think it's going to be good, but we'll keep an eye on that, of course. All right, next, let's talk about channel processing. This is where this board really seems to excel. I was really impressed because I didn't really know the extent to everything they had on here. So I'm going to give a real quick overview of what all is involved here. So we're looking at the home screen for a blank channel right now. I can click on the channel strip on the side and kind of work my way through what's happening. First off, let's talk about the filters. So I like that this console has a low cut and a high cut on every single channel. And it also has a tilt EQ, which is interesting. So if I click on tilt EQ and then let's go to our EQ here, you can kind of like a tone knob on an old mixer or radio, you can just make everything brighter or darker really, really simply here, which is interesting. I don't think I'd ever actually use that, but maybe for a volunteer, that could be an interesting option. Like I said, I like the filters. The screen is very responsive. There's also knobs for controlling these. I can see them on the filter screen, or if I'm in the EQ, I can see them there. You can see the EQ has a lot of bands, so not including the high cut and the low cut. We have 4 dedicated parametric EQs. We have a dedicated low shelf, a dedicated high shelf. You've got some interesting options. I'm just going to make a ridiculous looking EQ for a second here, turn it on. Again, something that I don't think I'd ever use, but it's neat that they have it in here, is there's a mix control. This is similar to some of the Yamaha consoles. I'm going to grab this universal encoder here, and if I turn the mix down, it'll flatten out, and if I go above 100%, it'll exaggerate my EQ settings, which is interesting. There is, of course, an RTA on here. If I had music going, you would see bands in the background. You can also change the color and how they look. They also have a little keyboard at the bottom here, so you can kind of get an idea of what note is causing issues, which could be interesting. The modeling on this console is fantastic. So up here, I'm going to click on Wing EQ, and I can switch to an SSL emulator. Let's see, what else do we have? Here's a Pultec, is also a really nice EQ that's on here. There's a bunch of different options. They all seem to sound pretty great. Now, one issue I did find is if you're monkeying around with this during a live service, for some reason, going from this mock EQ4 back to the Wing EQ while music is playing can sometimes cause a pop in the sound system, even if the EQ is off. So there's some sort of DSP glitch there. That seems to be the only thing like that I've found, but it's worth noting. So just be careful about what you do. I mean, you really shouldn't be changing a lot of this stuff during a service anyway. That's really what rehearsal's for. Let's see, back to our first section here. We've got input delay. I am a little bit disappointed that the input delay only goes up to 23.32 milliseconds, which is equivalent to 8 meters. I really wish they'd made it up to 25 for some processing things that I like to do. But that's okay, not the end of the world. You have a main and alternate input selection. This is great for virtual sound check. And if it's set to auto, when it's on auto, there's a button on the home screen that will flip all these for you. But if you don't want everything to flip, then being in manual is going to only do it when you tell it to do it on the channel, which is cool. Gate is pretty typical of the Behringer X32 gate. Except for there's an accent, which is pretty interesting. Obviously the graphics are a little bit more intense. Just like everything else, the controls can be done with a finger or knobs at the bottom of the screen, or there's some dedicated knobs over here on the side, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's some really interesting keying options to other channels. There's a key filter, which is great. But just like with the EQ, there are models of this. So again, there's an SSL style gate. This Even 88 is pretty excellent sounding so far. One interesting thing that they did here, apart from gates, they've put some of the compressors in here and some of the things that you might want on a channel that normally would not have a gate. So what I mean by that is, for example, the De-Esser, rather than being a rack effect, is now one of the gates on here, which makes sense because normally you'd use a De-Esser on a vocal, and normally a vocal wouldn't have a gate on it. So you can use the De-Esser instead, and then usually something like a drum is going to have a gate, but will probably not have a De-Esser on it. Now, the problem with this is that your De-Esser would be at the beginning of your chain, which you may not want that there because generally a De-Esser goes towards the end of the chain. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. I'm going to click on this home button again, and you see there's an edit button. And with it lit up, I can grab this gate and move it later on in the signal flow, which is really interesting. So you can completely customize within your 40 channels, again, not the last 8, but channels 1 through 40, the order of your channel strip, which is really neat. Let's skip ahead to our compressor. Again, fairly standard, just like what it was on the X32, but again, you've got your models. This emulation of a DBX 160 is excellent for drums. I'm incredibly impressed with the LA2A emulation. We are using that on a lot of things right now. It is a very good sounding compressor on this console from my limited testing. Getting a lot of use out of that so far. As I mentioned earlier, there is a dynamic EQ built into the gate section. It's a fairly simple dynamic EQ, but effective nonetheless. Mentioned this earlier, but there are 2 insert slots that you can use for the effects section, which we'll get into in a moment. So that's the rack effects that we have outside of the channel strips, in case you need to do that. And you'll notice that there's one above the fader, so pre-fade like you would normally do, and there's one after, which is interesting. So there's some cool things you can do with that if you wanted to. Buses, so a couple things that are important that are different compared to the X32. So again, you've got your 16 buses you can send to. You've got a independent pan control for each one. Panning for buses, just like in the X32, is inefficient on this console. That's where something like the mixing station app would be very useful. So you can see panning for multiple channels for a bus at the same time. So that would definitely be useful. One thing that's slightly disappointing compared to the X32, but the X32 is kind of its own beast in this regard. The X32, you could change your tap point for any given channel to any given bus, or at least pair of buses. So if I had an electric guitar and I wanted everybody to hear it pre-fade, but the electric guitarist wanted to hear it without any EQ or compression on it, I could change that for him without affecting everybody else. On here, it's a little different. Everything is either pre, post, or sub, but if it is pre, then you've got your own specific tap point for anything that is pre. And if you click on up here, you've got a pretty involved set of options anywhere in the signal chain, and even if you rearrange your signal path, you can still adjust within this. So one downside to the X32 was that the lowest you could go, you see we're getting some ghost changes. The lowest you could go on the X32 was the preamp plus the low cut. On this console though, I can go, oh, there we go, all the way to the bottom, so even the filter has no effect. So that's pretty useful. Another thing that's interesting is there is a specific EQ that you can use if you want to have a different EQ going to the monitors than what you have going to your main mix. So it's kind of like having a miniature monitor console built into your front of house console. It's probably a little more complicated than what I want to get into, but it's interesting that it's there, and I'm sure with discretion, they could be a useful trick to have. All right, let's move on to the effects. So I'm going to click on the effects button up here. Again, these are the rack effects that are outside of the individual channel strip. On the left, we have 8 premium or standard effects. And then on the right, these are specifically standard effects. So really what that means is on the left, you have your ability for things like reverbs, time-based stuff that requires a little bit more processing. And on the right, you have more of your standard things like, on the X32, I'd use these for like, say, De-Essers and that kind of thing. Now, what I have going on in this scene is I have my 4 main effects, which we'll talk about in a moment here. So I've got a room reverb, a plate reverb, a delay, and let's see, a SansAmp emulator, another reverb and delay that I'm using for different things. Now, normally my right-hand side would be mostly De-Essers, but the good thing is that I'm using De-Essers from individual channels instead, so that saves me from having to waste a lot of effects on that. One downside to everything being stereo or mono is that you don't have any dual effects, which for me, the biggest issue would be in regards to a De-Esser. But the other thing that might be a problem for you, depending on what your setup is you won't have any dual graphic EQs. They're all going to be a single channel. Let's see, we're again. They're all going to be a single channel because that single channel can be either mono or stereo. So, not the end of the world, but again, just something you're going to have to think through if you use a lot of graphic EQs from the effects rack normally. Now, one thing that's annoying about this effects page is that you can only access effects if they are applied to something already. So like I have a tape reverb on here that I can't actually get to any of the settings because it's not applied to a channel. So that's a little bit annoying. I'd like to, for like the sake of trying to figure out what I want to use, I'd like to be able to click on it and see it work. But otherwise, this is basically the same as what you would have on the X32. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the custom controls. This is similar to the assignable section of the X32. And hopefully you guys can see this okay. There is a lot of options on here. And sometimes if you're used to working on a console like an X32 or maybe an LS9 or anything that's kind of set in its ways, this can be a little bit overwhelming because you want to use everything. And just because it's there doesn't mean that you should use it. So we have a a group of knobs and buttons that come in sets. So right now I have this set to be just like in my X32 effects video. I've got a band verb, a vocal verb, a plate verb, a vocal verb, and a delay. You notice just touching the encoder will show me the level. So these are acting as volume. We've got the first row of buttons will act as sends on fader. The bottom row of buttons will put the effect on the screen. And again, there's 16 groups of these, so I can go up through my presets, and I'm only using the one right now. So we've got that. We also have colors assignable, same thing with input channels. Now, one thing that's kind of annoying about the colors is that not only do you have a bunch of colors to pick from, but you can turn the light on and off. Behringer, it would be more efficient if instead of having an on-off switch for the light, that we just have a palette that is black. To me, it would make more sense. One thing that I love, and Behringer, strangely enough, is the first console I've seen do this, is you can actually digitally label all these controls. So they will come up with a generic label when you make them, but I went through and typed in the things that I would put on a label maker. So B verb for band verb, plate, V verb for vocal verb, and delay. So you have no use for a label maker on this this board, which is fan-friggin-tastic. So this first set of knobs and buttons, again, there's 16 sets of those. Down here, we have some more buttons, and again, more digital labels. And these will basically always stay, at least as long as you have the user button pressed in. So as an extension to my my effects section, I have these mutes which will go to the actual bus for the effect. So I've got kill switches for all my effects, and then I've got a tap tempo for my delay at the bottom there. You also have a small 4-channel user configurable bus over here. This can be your main outputs, or in this case, it's some of the channels that I need to get to for transitions. All of your other banks are customizable as well. Now, one thing that I found interesting, so it's pretty well documented that you've got your individual channels 1 through 40, and then your aux 41 through 48, and then you've got your user channels. So again, some of my important things I need to get to very quickly. Well, one thing I didn't realize is that you can also customize the channels within this 1 to 12. It's more of a suggestion or a starting point. So that's really, really interesting, and that's very easy to do. Just like on some of the competition, if you click and hold the view button, you'll notice on the screen, you've got a list of all your possible channels and buses and DCAs, and you can just drag and drop. So, for example, if I wanted to switch Worship Leader 1 and Vox 2, I can just grab and switch, and now they're changed on the screen, and vice versa. And it's very smooth, works really well on the screen. But like I said, if I go to inputs 1 through 12, now I've got 1 through 12. And you can, if you see on here, 1 through 4 through 8, and then 9, 10, 11, and then 18? Because I wanted to move the guitar that was on there onto the next page. So it would be next to its buddy there. And then 18 was blank, so I put it in that other spot. So you can rearrange these. Now, the dangerous thing, anytime you have this much customization, I would suggest that you always try to stick within these numbers here. So 1 through 40, and then aux 1 through 8. And maybe rearrange, but don't remove anything from those groups. I would suggest that you always have a fader for every channel, because you could potentially remove everything and have all, bass guitar across the entire, board. But then if somehow you didn't realize the acoustic guitar was still on, and someone just plugged it in and now it's popping the sound system or it's feeding back, well, you'd have to go into the screen, add a fader, and then control it. So that's a very dangerous situation to be in that I've actually seen happen before. So I suggest trying to work within these limits, it'll make your life a little bit easier. Okay, a few things that I think a firmware update could fix, some things that are missing that I would like to see. Despite having all the custom layers, I would still really like to have DCA Spill. If you're not familiar with DCA Spill, it'd be something like maybe I could double tap on the drums and then all the input channels to my left would reflect the channels that are part of that drum group. And then as soon as I'm done with that, I can click on keys and then there's all my keys. It just makes things really, really fast when you have not a ton of faders. I mean, we only have really 12 faders that we can see at a time, but I'm not going to have really more than 12 of anything in a group. So having DCA Spill would take this board to the next level. Another option that other consoles have that I would like to see on here would be set nominal or reset. So some Yamaha boards and some Allen Heath boards, for example, if I was making, let's see, let's go to a bus. Here's an open bus, sends on fader. Let's say that I was making this into a post-fade mix and I wanted all the faders at 0. On this console, I'd have to go and push them up and then just try and get them as close to 0 as possible. On an Allen Heath or some Yamaha boards, I could hold down a button that says reset, flick the fader, and it would go exactly to 0. Or vice versa, I can flip it down and it'll go all the way down to negative infinity. That's really useful for creating post-fade mixes really quickly. So I would love to see that on this board. When it comes to sends on fader, one easy fix that needs to happen is now that I'm on sends on fader, nothing's flashing at me. It'd be very easy to get distracted and start mixing again, and now the bass player is bleeding out of his ears because I keep turning things up to his ears thinking it's the front of house mix. So I would like for when we're in sends on fader, for the very least, for this button to flash at me, maybe something on the screen to indicate. Even on the X32, things would turn red when you're on sends on fader, but it doesn't do that in this console, which could be an issue. As I mentioned earlier, also when you're in sends on fader and you're working on in-ear mixes, there's no quick way to see panning for a bunch of controls. Now you can, if I click view, I can see the panning for my left and right channels. You can see I got a few things panned in there, but not in the buses. So that's again where Mixing Station is definitely worth the money. It is free, but for like I think $8 you can get the pro version, and that'll actually give you pop groups, which is like DCA Spill that I talked about earlier, and then you can mix ears a lot faster from that app. Another missing option would be block select. So for example, if I was routing, let's see, I'm just randomly clicking things here. If I had all my local outs and I knew I wanted to route 8 things in a row to these, on a board like an Allen Heath, I could click block and then select multiple channels at a time. Same thing for when you're putting your channels into your custom slots. You could select multiple and then pull them at a time. That would be useful. That would save some time. All right, copy and paste. Now, the more you work with it, the better it is, but it is still a bit of an inefficient nightmare. Nightmare is a hard word. It's not as good as it was in the X32 as far as efficiency goes. So a few issues with copy and paste. So on the X32, if I were, say, on the EQ screen and hit utility, it would have all the different things that you could copy and paste, but it would automatically filter down to what I had on the screen, so in this case being just EQ. For me to do that here, I would have to select none and then turn on just EQ or whatever else it is that I want. Not a big deal, but when you're in a rush and you want to copy, that EQ, it's just one more thing that you have to do. So the other issue is when you copy, one, you can only copy from a like-minded channel. So like I'm on a input channel right now, so I could copy to another channel, but I couldn't copy the same EQ to, say, a bus, which seems like a rare thing that you would have to do, but I had to do it earlier for something I was working on. And even though it was the same type of EQ, it would not let me copy that over. So that was kind of annoying. When you copy, you start with the channel you're on, and then you select the channel. So I'm gonna click overheads. And if you notice, my destination changed over here. So I can now copy onto there. This can get a little bit confusing. And also, there's no internal memory for copy and paste. So if I wanted to say, let's say I made a really ridiculous EQ, but it sounded good, and I wanted to copy that, try a modeler, and then I decide, oh, I like the other thing better, I want to paste my old EQ back on. You can't currently do that on this firmware. You would have to have a dummy channel that you would copy your settings onto, do what you want. Oh, I don't like it. Now I have to go to that other channel and copy it back onto this channel. So you can only copy instantaneously from one channel to another, which is kind of annoying. I would also like to see, since they have the destinations thing, it'd be cool if you could copy to multiple channels at a time. Say you made a vocal chain that you like and you want to copy it across the next 5 channel strips. That would be nice if that was an option. Not the end of the world if you don't have it. But again, I really hated this the first day I was working on it. I've gotten used to it now. One thing I love about copy and paste is that you can turn on connection, meaning that the input source can be copied as well. So if you want to actually move your channel strips around, doing this is a lot easier on here than it was on the X32. All right, next let's talk about this channel strip, fat channel, whatever you want to call it, this over here. I know that the way they market this is that one person can be working on the screen while a second operator can be working on the channels over here. I mean, I guess if you actually do that, this would be useful. I do find it kind of cumbersome. Again, I'm getting used to it the more I'm on the board. One thing, all this is basically the stuff that was on the left side of the screen on the X32, and then things like the monitor section used to be on the right side of the X32, so they basically flipped the board mirror image, so it does take a little getting used to. One quick tip that is awesome, and Presonus did something similar to this, but unfortunately, every time the board would restart, you'd have to do it again. So this view button here, when you very first get the console, it defaults to being off, meaning I can be on, say, the routing page here, and I can be messing around with, and I'm sorry, I can't really get my camera quite right, but I can be messing around with, say, the compressor over here, and it doesn't change the screen, and I can see the compressor settings on this little mini screen, which is kind of cool. Also, I wish this could scooch up like the screen does. So again, as a single operator, I actually find that less than helpful. So what you can do is if you hold down this view button for a few seconds and it turns green, we are now locking it to where anything I touch on this, this fat channel or whatever it is they call it, channel processing strip will make it pop up over here. So like if I even just touch the gate button, now my gate for this channel is on the screen. If I touch EQ, my EQ is on the screen. So I do like that. Now I've gotten used to that. I like it a lot. You can control every single parameter on here. So if I go to gate, you can see there's little dots in the bottom right-hand corner. If I hit gate again, oops, it'll cycle through the things that this one knob is controlling. Again, as a single engineer, I don't really see the benefit in that. So I keep them all on the first little dot. And this is basically just like on the X32 where I've got my my threshold control that I can get to right away, or in this case it's gain because I happen to be on that compressor. Oh, here we go. It's because I hit it twice. There we go. Boop. So leaving it in view mode and having everything on the first bubble is a lot more fun. One thing that I find annoying about the EQ, this is kind of taking off from like how the D-Live is set up. So if you notice, there are 4 gain controls ready to go on the board here. And we'll throw on the Wing EQ. So if I mess with these knobs, I've got gain control, which is useful, but I would much rather have a gain, frequency, and Q, and then a button to switch between the bands. So these knobs are kind of, I don't want to say useless, but like, I guess once you have them set, this could be useful. But I find myself, the more I use this board, just navigating on the screen is a lot easier and just using the controls over here to maybe get there a little bit quicker. Because if you're in this section, it basically is what I'm talking about. So you can select the band you want, and then you've got gain, Q, and frequency. I wish we could just flip these two, but I'll get used to that in about a week. So I find that using the screen, I'm not usually a EQ the finger kind of guy, but this console makes it so easy that I think I might just start going for that. Speaking of which, one thing I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the EQ, this band solo button over here is, sorry, might have just killed my mic when I did that. The band solo button is phenomenal because what it does is it'll send to your headphone mix the frequency range that your EQ is set on, even if it's not boosting or cutting. So like if your pastor has a whistling sound coming out of his mouth and you want to find it and you don't want people to hear you sweeping around trying to find it, you can hit, say, it's going to be a high mid, you could hit that EQ, hit band solo, sweep around. No one will hear it but you and your headphones. Once you find that frequency, then you can start gaining it down and getting rid of it. So that's really, really cool that that's built in there, and I like that a lot. Finally, when it comes to the mains, so mains and matrices, again, you have 4 main mixes. Now, one thing that I'm finding that could be useful for that is, again, if you're doing broadcast mix off one computer, maybe you have Spotify that you're playing and you don't want that to go over the stream online because you might get dinged on copyright issues. This could be useful, a way to control that separately, or for like a lobby feed, something to that effect. I wish that you could turn these into pre-fade mixes, because then that would give us another 4 in-ear mixes we could work with. But it's not the end of the world. I think we're just going to have to find a use for that, or it's just something that is just a little bit extra. There's a lot of extra in this board, and I'm okay with that because you can always whittle down from extra. But so far, and again, we've only had the console 2 days, I am pretty concerned about this this ghost touch thing. It doesn't happen a lot, and it hasn't caused an issue yet, but it could if you were in the patching screen for an extended period of time. But other than that, the console sounds great. I'm very impressed with the plugins that are built into the board. So far, we're using it with some Waves plugins as well, and that's working out splendidly. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful. I know it's been a long video, and I apologize for the jumpy screen. If there's anything that you would like me over the next few weeks while we're installing this at this church to do videos on, please feel free to reach out. I'll try and link Behringer actually did a very good series of like 12 videos that were kind of under the radar. I didn't see them. They came out in January, but I just found them the other day because they're not on their main page. They're on some sort of secondary YouTube site they have, which doesn't make sense. But they're really good. They're very short, and they cover all these sections very efficiently. So if you're thinking about getting one of these boards, that would be a great place to start. But again, if there's something you'd like me to cover in one of my videos, I'm happy to do so. We are doing some pretty intricate routing for this setup. We're going to have this wing's going to end up being the broadcast wing. There's going to be another wing at front of house, and that's going to connect to an X32 rack for the band's in-ear monitor mix. So there's going to be a pretty intricate AES-50 network that's happening. So I'm happy to talk about that if that's helpful for you. But yeah, feel free to leave comments on anything you need. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Until next time, have a great week. Again, this is Chad from Ascension Worship. I hope this has been helpful for you and your team. Come back here every Tuesday for new information.